in Italy, US bilateral cooperation. He has been actively involved in Italy-Africa space engagement, offering insights into European partnerships with African countries in satellite systems, Earth observation, and cooperative research. His perspective links diplomatic defense and commercial dimensions of international space policy. And our last panelist is Rose Crochet. Amazing. Rose Crochet is an international relations specialist within the Office of Space Commons covering Africa, South America, India, and parts of Europe. Ms. Crochet works to improve the policy, regulatory, and business environment for U.S. space commerce and international commerce space cooperation more broadly. Ms. Crochet published the Handbook for Space Capability Development in 2023 and continues her volunteer work to support all countries' adoption of space-related technology as a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. Before joining CGD and the OSC, Ms. Crochet was an accomplished program and operations manager with the U.S. Air Force, specializing in space operations, security cooperation, and development, peacekeeping, disaster management, and military intelligence. Rose completed her Bachelor of Arts degree from Rutgers University in 2000 and her Master of Arts in Diplomacy and International Commerce from Norwich University in 2011. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. So our first segment, why Africa, why now? My question to Dr. Nelson. I hope you can see me. Okay. You've been a leading advocate for Africa's place in global governance. Why is this the moment for Africa to assert itself in space diplomacy and development?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I think for me, it comes from the perspective of this realization that if we're going to be a spacefaring civilization in the next 50 to 100 years, then we certainly need to design a future for space intentionally that ensures that all humans have the right to access space. So I'm very much at the forefront of the Space for All movement. That's number one. Number two, I do believe that as we think about some thorny questions, which my major driving question is, how do we share space? For centuries, for millennia, all humans have looked up at the stars and have names, have created legends, have created mythology, they have created gods that we have worshipped. And now that we may be dispelling with the idea of a creator God that is in the moon or is off the moon or the stars, I do think we need to still be prepared to have a conversation of what it means then to be a civilization that is moving into a new stage of our development. And so for me, there can be no future of humanity in space without Africa, which is still, as far as we know, considered the birthplace of humanity, to be at the table, helping to shape not just, let's say, the technical ways in which we might move forward, but also helping to shape how do we create the law, the rules, the regulation, how do we share the rule books, how do we share the decision-making processes, how do we share the way we manage this still one blue planet we call home. And so I think that having Africa and African universities in particular, because I'm focused on universities, so I very much want to talk to you. How are we going to ensure that we create the talent pipeline and the functional capability? And according to my friend and colleague here, she's the one that first taught me the word functional capacity or functional capability or functional literacy. How do we create that talent pipeline? So this is why I'm so passionate and have been an advocate since I started working on this in 2018.
That's amazing. Please let's the talent pipeline. I love what she said that and how you emphasized on the importance of talent. Thank you so much for that. My next question is to Colonel Violetti. From Italy's perspective, why is Africa a strategic partner in space cooperation, and where do you see opportunities for collaboration?
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here also. First, I would like to say that um, I work for the government, so it's like, and I have some notes because actually I'm specialized for Italy, US in particular, but as you know, Italy is doing a great job, and we are pushing a lot in cooperation space, especially with the African countries. So I would say that Italy started to. It's a long-lasting cooperation. Basically, we started very in the 60s to work in Africa, especially in Kenya in that time, and we had the first. I don't know if everyone knows, but we launched the first time from cooperation with the US in Malindi on a base called the Royal Space Center in 1964, our first satellite. So since then, we have worked so much with Kenya, starting there. But I want to point out that in 2024, the Italian government decided to start this new strategy reinforcing collaboration between Italy and Africa. In fact, it's a plan called the Piano Mattei, and the cooperation is not only about space, but it's also a political and economical cooperation. I would like to, we start in the exactly 29 of January 2024, but then we had already two meetings. One in July 2024 in Rome, and it's called Italy Africa Space Leader Conference. We had more than 20 African countries joining, and then we had another one in Rome on 20 June 2025, and we are trying to get the European Commission involved to try to support Italy and African cooperation. Later, maybe we can talk about what are the strategy that we are doing there. But coming back to your question, why is important for us, especially for Italy, and why we think we should invest in Africa in space technology. Of course, it's just, Africa is a very favorable geographical position. In fact, we started, as I said, with this launching there. We are very close to Ecuador, so it's a great country to create infrastructure and to start to launch capabilities from there. Then, as far as we see, it's a really important and growing market. I mean, there are so many opportunities. There is so much demand on satellite applications, especially compared to what we can do with satellites. Especially, like when we think about natural disaster, border control, or like flushing water disasters there. So it's really a growing market that we can improve and we can push from their side. And of course, from a geopolitical point of view, for Italy, it's really important because actually it could be a way to lead the full European country and full world to work with Africa directly. And another thing I will not last but not least is we see there a lot of human power. It's like a lot of young people that willing to learn more and more. There is a lot of needs to learn, and as I said, we can talk later about Canada, but we are really investing in trying to teach and to share our knowledge in space in Africa. So that's much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. Hello? Thank you so much for that answer. I love how you talked about, how students are eager and willing to learn, that human capital, that willingness that Africans have to contribute to the space sector. And now, my question for the panel is, where does Africa have unique advantages or opportunities in the global space sector?
actually, I'd like to get to that, but I'd like to reflect from the U.S. side the same question that went to Italy, because we are very much aligned, I think, in our interest in working in Africa, working with Africa service providers, working with African customers. It's really an era where the full ecosystem is coming together. Where you have universities, you have government, you have commerce, and they all interconnected. They kind of grow together. So I'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in our conversation. But to talk about U.S. interest in Africa very briefly, we also have a historical component since the 60s. I don't know if everyone realizes this, but the U.S. shuttle program had multiple emergency landing strips in Africa for the U.S. shuttle, because it made the most direct place to land if we had a problem launching from Florida. So that was in the Gambia, Morocco, Nigeria, Senegal. We also have really crucial communications equipment. I mean, Africa has a really obvious geographic advantage. They're on a different spot on the planet than the continental United States, and we need to put equipment there in order to talk to our satellites or shuttle or whatever it is we have on the moon or Mars further. We need to have somebody on that side of the planet who's able to point in that direction. So, an example of that is NASA, South Africa's space agency's lunar exploration ground sites, or LEGs. They particularly being used to support the Artemis program and those missions to Moon and Mars. And then also, of close interest to the Office of Space Commerce, where I'm working from, is space situational awareness. So, every year, more and more satellites are getting launched. Right now, it's around 11,700 active satellites in orbit. And there are many more thousands of inactive satellites and millions of pieces of debris. And we really don't want things to run into each other. That's of interest to the United States and interest to African space actors. It's interest to the globe. And so, we are interested in working with Africa to make sure that we all have common norms and standards about how we run our satellites. So we're all safe and we're able to continue to access space. Briefly on science, there's been a long history of African cooperation with the United States on various scientific endeavors. One of the most exciting ones coming to bear that I have to brag on Africa for is the Square Kilometer Array, which is a multi-continental effort. U.S. just supported with some of the design, but we are not the leaders of this program. But you're talking about thousands of radio antennas across Australia and Africa in order to essentially be able to develop a square kilometer cube of snapshot of very distant locations in space that's fundamentally help us understand how creation works. It's really exciting, cutting edge stuff. And this system should come online, by 2029 or so. So that is an example of a capability U.S. does not have. And we are really excited about working with African scientists and scientists from around the world to understand this data and learn from it as humanity, not just any particular country, right? Plus, NASA has cooperative agreements with 50 institutions in Africa. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of cooperation that's going on a very working level, And then sorry, I'm taking too much time. I'll just briefly mention a couple of things, and that is recognizing that the United States does provide some ground floor capabilities. GPS is a free service that the U.S. provides to everyone on the planet. So it's used so much that it's become invisible. But that's like a $2 billion program a year the U.S. spends to make sure this position navigation and timing program is up and running consistently for decades. We also have an open data program. So every single U.S. civil satellite provides their data for free to anyone in the world. And NOAA, where I'm coming from the Department of Commerce, we operate 18 weather satellites, and all that data is available. So I kind of chuckle a little bit when I see, for example, China offering access to one satellite's worth of data, like this huge revelation, when we've been doing this for decades. So we just have to talk about it more, which is why I'm taking a minute to talk about it, because it's exciting, And there has been a real shift toward kind of a new not new approach, but the U.S. is shifting away from, in Africa broadly, not just space, from a donor-recipient model. Like I said, it's not the only model we've been using, but broadly, toward a partnership model built on mutual economic interests. So some things that are newer that the U.S. and Africa are working together on. U.S. launch services are launching African satellites. New communication satellites like Starlink or Amazon Kuiper or other companies are providing new options for connectivity, for digital infrastructure. We've got associated ground-based infrastructure like gateways and points of presence and receivers across Africa to help connect space to Earth and those humans living and working on Earth. We're buying satellite components from African makers. Something like, I don't know, this is secondhand information, so I can't say it's written in stone, but what I've heard is 40% of American satellites are using some component made in South Africa. So, don't think that this is just like going one way. It's a two-way economy. It's a two-way, set of cooperation. And then there's so much opportunity where, GPS or other position navigation and timing systems, Earth observation data, and new communication options are being mixed in different ways for different customers on the African continent. And that's an entire new market, moving out of the data scientist lab and into people are building apps to help, fishermen off the coast of the Gulf of Guinea, or helping people manage their herds in Kenya. It's really exciting interpretation of jointly developed data. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to get all that out there.
Thank you so much for that. Very insightful, and I love how you shared with us, that this data that's been freely given to us, and the opportunities that are out there for Africans. And then my question to Dr. Haynes is that you've spoken about the politics of space security. What risks and opportunities exist for African nations in this emerging strategic domain?
Thank you so much for the question. I'm taking in a lot of things that everyone has said, and because a lot of my work is done on the arms control security side of the world, I look at our relationships with allies and also our enemies or frenemies, depending on what time of the day it is. China falls into some sort of category. And so one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to is, while I'm really happy that the relationship with Africa, and Africa is a really big continent with a lot of countries, with many African countries has switched to a partnership model, I think one of the things that we must be mindful of is actually sticking to that and not just saying that. And right now in our kind of political landscape, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that's going to look like going forward, especially as the U.S., we switched to a more kind of defense first posture, kind of retreating from the diplomatic stage, and China is trying to really come in and fill that void. That is one of the things that, in my estimation, if someone were to ask me what's one of the challenges, it would be that. It would be very confusing rhetoric for a lot of African countries that's coming out of our country right now about, who belongs here, who doesn't belong here. I'm a co-chair for the Space Security Law and Policy Working Group through WCAPS, and our motto is space is for everyone. But is that a real thing, or are we just saying that? Who gets to sit at the table? Who gets to make these decisions? Who gets to work in the current space economy right now? It's all these are very important questions because we can talk about partnership, we can talk about the different projects that's going on the continent, but we have to really anchor this in a reality of the geopolitical situation right now. And so there's China over there who's trying to fill this void of kind of our retrenchment from diplomacy. And then there's also a people problem. I'm sitting here as a Black woman, and over 300,000 of us have been pushed out of the workforce, and many of us out of the federal government, right? So who's going to be at these decision-making tables? Who gets the opportunity to actually have a stake at what's happening on the continent, where you have the youngest talent of just amazing and brilliant minds of any continent on the planet? So, there's a people problem, and then there's a diplomacy problem. there is a multilateral problem. And so these are some of the larger, broader challenges from a kind of governance perspective, a security perspective. What is cooperation going to look like writ large in space? When we think about rules of the road, when we think about different types of tech that's being developed to enhance the militarization of space. So these are some really big questions, which is where the kind of world of arms control focuses on, these really big questions. Who is going to have the right to not only defend themselves in the space domain, but who's going to have the legitimacy to come to the table and be able to have a stake in their own security future? So these are the type of things that I think about, but I'm glad that there are programs that we are doing with Africa. We could be doing a lot more, but first and foremost, it is really about, do we mean this partnership model? Do we really mean it? Because it's really hard to tell right now.
Thank you so much for that. Who gets to sit at these tables? The decision makers. I love the emphasis that you made on that, Dr. Nelson.
I just like to pick up on that because I had the privilege many years ago, before I got into this space conversation, to have been invited to the Pentagon, the US Air Force, to talk about 2040 US security. And I was wondering, like, why me, right? Because I was just plucked from oblivion, so to speak. And one of the things they said was, we really wanted you here because you represent a sort of a person who is, number one, you're an immigrant, number two, you're an engineer, but you're also an artist and you're also an activist. So you kind of sit in many worlds and see the world from a different place, and we need to understand you. And I had, over the course of that year, the opportunity to go to 2 Air Force bases and a national security forum, and go back to the Pentagon to quote unquote report on my findings. And one of the things I said in response to your point was that this is assumption that is very dangerous, that we only have to worry from a security perspective about the big actors, right? And so it's really critically important that organizations like a Texas A&M, for example, partner with the universities like the ones that I'm working with to create a different level of quote-unquote science diplomacy. And my hope is that the budget doesn't get cut for those things, because while I like to say the big boys are playing footsie with our future, we the people have to figure out how do we at least keep a conversation going at the people level. We can't be at certain tables, we're just not invited. But can we at least be at the table where people who are at the science functionaries, science professors, students are exchanging information in such a way that we deepen that long-term hope for a neutral, quote-unquote, war-free zone in space. And so it's critical for all of humanity to really focus on the fact that we have literally reached a stage where we can self-destruct as a species. This is no longer a question. I'm a part of the Lifeboat Foundation. We talk about existential threats. So in space is a domain where we can self-destruct. So I think it's important to have these conversations, as small as they seem to be, keep the thread of conversation going, so that while the governments are working out the big conversations, we're still having these conversations. And academic spaces, I think, are one place where that could continue. And I'm really hoping that we can hold on to at least that little sliver of hope that some of us have, that we can save ourselves from mutually assured destruction.
Thank you so much. Yes?
Excellent. I absolutely agree. And I would refer to President Bush and his program 1,000 Points of Light, right? It doesn't have to be top down. And real cooperation is between individual humans who make a decision to make one thing better, So I think that is an absolutely valid and important thing to keep alive. I was at the International Astrological Congress last year, and we had a roundtable on space situational awareness that included Dr. Tidiane Ouattara from the Africa Space Council, and I have to credit the African Union, the African Union Commission, with establishing this incredible pool of expertise that is accessible to every member of the African Union, to help get incredibly experienced, both politically and technically, individuals to make them accessible to programs that are emerging space actors who are trying to figure out how to implement their programs, how to leverage space, and it's also been useful because now we have in a relatively small set of people someone the United States government can talk to, that can have that representational role that Dr. Claire has been talking about. Because one of the challenges prior to the existence of that council has been how do we talk to 54 countries? Like and each one has their individual needs. It's just too hard for a small office like mine, to be able to maneuver, and that's multiplied across the U.S. interagency. Anyway, my point is, Dr. Tidiane's main point at that venue was Africa wants to be at the table. If we're deciding how we're going to operate in space, both in our immediate orbits, because low Earth orbit is the most crowded, one we're most concerned about, but in all orbits and future destinations like commercial space stations or on the moon or points further away, Africa needs to be a part of that conversation. And it was, he articulated this beautifully to this international organization. I think he was very well heard. So the African Space Council always has a space at the table when Office of Space Commerce is involved, at least.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love that. Africa needs to be in these spaces. You cannot just exclude Africa, which leads to this question, actually. How can African nations and the diaspora communities ensure participation in the rapidly growing space economy? Anyone can take it?
I'll take that question.
Okay.
And I'm glad you asked the diaspora question, right? Because it's everyone on deck. One of the things through WCAPS, through the working group, Space Security, Law and Policy, SSLP, we developed this concept called Beyond STEM. And what that does is talk about how the same sort of resources that's been poured into STEM needs to also happen within policy and law education within the space domain. That's how you kind of open it up. That's how you include more people. That's how you get more thinkers and ideas to the table. Yes, STEM is important, obviously. We need that. But we also need the policy. We also need the law part. And why we decided to broaden that out is because when you look at demographics from across different universities, different graduate programs, there aren't that many space-related programs that you can go to, right? In terms of policy, in terms of law. But on the STEM side, there's all types of opportunities and fellowships and scholarships, which there should be. But if we are talking about humans living in space, right? We are talking about colonization. We are talking about building colonies in the very near future so we can mine, right? What sort of populations are we imagining in space? Are we thinking about a situation where there will just be the scientists who know how to do the things, and then you have people who know how to like keep machinery and stuff together? It will be creating these very classist civilizations all over again in space, right? So trying to broaden it up and trying to bring more people to the conversation, to the space table, is one of the ways in which there's greater participation, not just on the continent, with students who might be interested in policy and law, and then also here. I think there's an opportunity. I went to school in West Africa, and I know what I got out of that situation many years ago, to have more cross-integrated work from here to the continent, have those sort of programs, at the University of Ghana where I went, So that's how we can kind of deepen these partnerships and relationships in a very meaningful and real way that we we can start training people in other aspects of space that aren't just STEM focused, or they can be some sort of hybrid program where you're doing space security law with some sort of science component, some sort of engineering component. So that's one practical way.
Thank you so much for that.
I just really like to jump in because this is really my wheelhouse. So when I started Space from Ghana back in 2023, our first conference was in Kenya. Last year we went to Ghana. This year we went to Nigeria. And as everybody knows, World Space Week is coming. And I'm soon going to hopefully leave here with some people who have signed up to be either expert witnesses or judges on what we're calling the first Africa Parliament of the Future Youth Assembly and Debates. And this is being designed by one of the very brilliant young space lawyers I met in Nigeria. I've kind of coached them to do certain things. I'm really excited beyond belief. We have another group out of Uganda who is leading the hackathon, AI for Space hackathon. So again, I'm picking up cards. So next week, World Space Week, we're actually doing the first virtual analog simulation of a lunar reserve. We're trying to stay away from the term colony. So we came up with this concept called a lunar reserve. And it all began with my story, Moon Runnings. I'm a Jamaican, everybody knows the story of Cool Runnings. So I wrote something called a future memoir set in the year 2038, when I talked about my life as the first Jamaican on the moon. And in constructing the story back in 2016, it really is the catalyst for so much of what I'm doing now, in terms of mapping out how this could happen. And one of the things we created in my fictional future was that we had actually arrived at a point where there was actually a cooperatively owned village on the moon. Now, is such a thing possible? In theory, yes. People, I'm sure, laugh at me, but I'm saying, well, if Mondragon in Spain could happen to, over the years, develop a protocol to create a whole city that is run by cooperatives and it's $1 billion operation, they run businesses of every kind. There's no reason why, with the technologies available today, and the fact we have cross-border trading, we have stable coins, we have all sorts of new things that didn't exist, we can't play around. So I do believe that analog research partnering with universities, we have 4 universities on board so far, and my goal is to try and identify, beyond Morgan State, where we have one partner in the US, identify other US universities that really want to partner in this way with African universities and do the real work of not just talking about these things at the level of these conferences, but actually going there and sitting on the phone and with me literally screaming at the student, how many times must I say this? You're driving me crazy. And will it be me, but they need to hear and see that kind of level of one-on-one technical assistance and coaching down to the level of the students who, I must say one last, have actually designed and will be building the solar energy off-grid platform that will hopefully power our analog habitat, which I don't know right now where I'll be sleeping week after next.
Thank you so much. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. Great, what I hear so far. And actually, I just want to take this opportunity to say, in Italy, we started many years ago, but actually I really was inspired by their talk before, on the fact that we could really do something really concrete to start and to develop a space economy in Africa. And basically, we have some experience in developing, especially in exploration. As you know, we have built more than 50% of space station. We have many capabilities in satellites, and so what we did to start really create a space knowledge in Africa. So basically, in the Panama that I was telling before, there are 3 pillars on which we are really doing things in Africa. And it's first education, of course. Second, training. I came back what you were saying, Noah, and the capacity building. So basically, the goal is really to develop technical, scientific, and industrial capabilities directly in the continent, not just like talking, but doing things really there, because people need to see and to know what means to do space. And for example, for technical training, we started to teach there in Malindi students how to develop like hyperspectral and SAR imaging, how to the long term, what does it mean long term sustainability, and what does it mean space economy. We are like doing an educational program on CubeSat. So basically, we are teaching how to build CubeSat, and basically we are like sponsoring and we are funding a constellation of six CubeSat. Now there are 6 CubeSat that are not so big, but it's the way to start to do to start to share technologies in Africa. And another interesting initiatives, we were talking about the ASC before. Next week will be in Sydney, so we are supporting, we are finding fellows to go there, of course from Africa, to go there and to be part of ISC and to understand from real what does mean being in space. And not only the fellows, but also we are supporting 12 SMEs to go there and to start to share their technologies in real world ISA. So last thing I want to mention that we just opened an international school for space education in Malindi 2 years ago, and it's full running. So this is a way I think that each nation should do to really to start to develop. I would say, as I said before, a knowledge of what space really means.
Thank you so much for that. An economy that doesn't thrive on knowledge, that's very questionable. But I love how we're trying to inform and educate the people of Africa so that they can have their voices heard in the space sector. So we're going onto the third segment on governance and partnerships. So Dr. Nelson, how do you see Africa shaping international norms in space through the AU, the United Nations, or other forums?
I'm not sure I got the question. How do I think the policy?
Let me repeat it. How do you see Africa shaping international norms in space through the AU, the UN, or other forums?
That is a very interesting question. So, and actually, the simulation we'll be doing for World Space Week is beginning to tap into how I think it could shape it. One of the questions that is up for debate is this idea of ownership. And I've been told on many occasions that space is not a commons, the moon is not a commons, and when we have the land on the moon or land on Mars. So the first thing I said to one of the people who I heard talk about land on Mars, I said, first of all, there's no land on Mars. Let's just start from scratch. There is just a surface. And we need to rethink and just reimagine that future. We already know how the last 1,000, 2,000 years, let's say, since written law has existed. And so I would like to see the people from the indigenous peoples communities in particular, whether they be in Africa or other parts of the world, that have been able to work through how do you communally own stuff. And especially for African countries where they have Western law side by side with traditional law. So for example, the land that we will be occupying for our analog is actually owned by a tribe, so we can't buy it, we can only use it. What does that mean then? Suppose we're to find that the rocks actually have some rare earth mineral that has just been discovered. There are lots of these rocks on the ground, and I'm praying that I discover something in them. But the fact is, how then would I negotiate with these communities that, listen, you're actually sitting on a gold mine? And I saw one of the things that this African Parliament of the Future is going to do, and even though I'm just doing it as an experiment for this project, I do intend to keep it going, because I do think coming out of the UN Pact for the Future, and it's one line on space. They don't have like one paragraph on space in the Going Back to the Future that was signed last year. We have an opportunity to put new ideas on the table. So I already asked these young people to think about creating a special working group within the African legal framework that will begin to write and study this issue of traditional law and its application to traditional land rights and its application to space law. So that's one specific way I think we can get at least a conversation started.
Okay, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for that. And then my next question is to Colonel Violetti again. What lessons can we draw from Italy's cooperation with African space agencies, and where are the gaps?
Okay. Yes. For this question, I talked a little bit to the Italian Space Agency and asked them. Basically, they the lesson learned pretty much were like that we should start on concrete impacts. It means that we need to understand the areas where there are real benefits for the population. So this could be like really let people understand where to go. Then another lesson learned is like they discovered that there is a missing of infrastructures usually in Africa, and this is a huge problem, and that's why they are supporting with like some investments and funds to start to build first infrastructure and then keep doing that. Another thing that they point me out is like there is a huge, it's like a problem, technology transfer. There are some still barriers there, and they are trying to share much more technology, but still it's not easy. It's not easy to just have so many constraints about there. And one last point is, of course, the regulation framework. Still, there is no regulatory framework in Africa, so they are trying to build this. This was a huge gap because actually, without rules, especially in space, US teaches this. You cannot really build an ecosystem, and of course, financial. Now, to fix the financial, I think is the biggest problem. We need investors, we need investments, and from other countries to start to invest in Africa. But as further they discovered, there is, as I said before, a huge part of society, the community that is willing to learn, to know. So it's like, it's very easy. It's just about the strategy. We need to find the strategy to start to invest there and to really to fill these gaps that are still there.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Haynes, you have raised concerns about academic freedom in space security discussions. How can African scholars and diaspora navigate these sensitivities while still contributing to policy innovation?
Can you read the first part again?
You have raised concerns about academic freedom in space security discussions. How can African scholars and the diaspora navigate these sensitivities while still contributing to policy innovation?
Right. So, it is a very challenging time in the academy, inside the federal government for certain communities. But one of the things that is always is the kind of way that I figured out to make sure that opinions and ideas, observations are still being heard is to start with substance. For instance, there was a recent meeting in Geneva, and there weren't really many substantive outcomes from the meeting, other than there are countries that came to the table that were willing to continue to talk about some of the global space security concerns. There's one side of the table that definitely believes that we need to have a stronger interpretation of space law and how to apply it. There's the other side of the argument that says, that countries should be able to volunteer into how they want to move forward in terms of norms and behaviors. So understanding the policy debates, the current policy debates, being up to date with that sort of information is how you can continue to contribute to the conversation, right? While there are other issues in terms of, again, who gets to participate. One of the ways in which I think a lot of scholars that look like me, academics and practitioners that look like me, is making sure that our value is always grounded in a substance. I know that there are a lot of folks who believe that they can't do this work without the advocacy piece, and I absolutely believe that. But when we're talking about things like global space security, more than the advocacy piece, what I care about is the current state of multilateralism, the current state of cooperation in space, the growing arms race in space, right? So people can always kind of agree around those substantive policy concerns, the current situation regarding treaties and agreements. Will the U.S., will we continue to pay attention to Article 9 in the Outer Space Treaty? Different type of legal questions, right? Different types of agreement and treaty questions. So that's a very meandering way of saying that in this moment, while there are freedoms that are under attack, you lean into the substance, you show up, and that's how you add value, is that you know what the current policy debates are, and you can you can leave your mark by saying, you know what, yes, I may have feelings and thoughts about the way that the world is reshaping itself, but this is what I care about substantively, and this is how we can all sit at this table and try to negotiate even in challenging times, is if we lean into the substance and we lead from policy.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for that. Rose Crochet, I actually wanted to ask you the very same question. I'll just repeat myself. How can African scholars and the diaspora navigate these sensitivities while still contributing to policy innovation?
So the oldest idea of a democracy is that we're a marketplace of ideas, right? And I think that still holds true. We absolutely need multiple voices to challenge what we're doing and how we're doing it, to make sure we have, a smart, deliberate way forward. So some spaces where that kind of conversation is being held, I would highlight the Artemis Accords. So the Artemis Accords is a collection of nations that come together and are talking essentially about how to implement the Outer Space Treaty in a very practical way. Like, how are we, if we land on the moon and we're experimenting with extracting resources, do we inform each other if we're operating in the same space? Do we agree not to land on historical landmarks on the moon and disturb the first footprint on Earth? What are the norms? Very practical. How do we interpret the Outer Space Treaty that was written in the '60s today? And so in fact, they have a meeting at the IAC next week, and hold that annually, where they walk through issues like this. And there's many intersectional meetings that are happening. And so it's one forum that's really focused on implementation. I think that's really interesting. Another area is, for example, the International Telecommunications Union. We forget that a major way we communicate is through spectrum use, and you have to use radio spectrum in order to collect information and move information to and from the Earth and to and from locations in space. And this is an incredible institution that has been functioning for decades, that has managed to share a common resource, especially geostationary orbits and related spectrum. So and Africa is absolutely at the table there through an incredible system of regional meetings and then build into a global meeting. I think one of the challenges for many smaller nations is there's so many of these conversations being held in faraway and expensive locations. So you have to be in Geneva, you have to be in New York, you have to be wherever they're having these meetings, and you can't have just like one or two people. No one human can hold all of the skill sets needed, nor attend all of the meetings where these substantive meetings are being held. And so again, I'll point back to the Africa Space Council as an excellent resource where they're making from the outside looking in. I don't mean to speak for them, but they're making decisions about how can we make sure we have substantive representation when not every country can be at XYZ or gather all the expertise needed, because they're also like running their own space programs at home. It's not, you could spend your entire career just working internationally, and so it's just a way to manage that. So it's a real challenge. And then the last piece when we're talking about practical implementation is, I'll speak from the commerce side, a good business case. You don't. The most stable space programs are not just doing space to do space, but to accomplish a very grounded goal that is often a non-space goal. We're trying to make sure we can use Earth observation data to predict what our cocoa crop is going to be in the spring, so we're able to manage our own market well and make sure our goods get to market, and that we know just as much about our crop as Wall Street does in New York that's leveraging this data. So you can be at the table and you can make sure those farmers are getting a good deal. So it's a very grounded business case to use a space application, and that's what you can build a program around, even something as humble as that. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So now we're going on to the questions. If the audience has any questions to ask the panelists, please feel free. Yes.
Hi, Justin Gloucester. So a few questions. One question I have is, how do the U.S.'s goals align with Africa's goals to grow? I think some of the things I see are around collaboration, Artemis Accord. It's a lot of collaboration, influence, and possible maybe ways to either have more power or have more influence. Versus I think help Africa grow in the space industry. On a from the Italy perspective, I see educational work. I see transformational work, and other work in regards to helping build up the space industry in Africa with Kenya and Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering what the U.S. is doing to either match that, given the growing influence of China and the other partnerships with Russia from some of the other African countries. Thank you.
Take a stab at that. So I think that the U.S. government is probably not, from a development point of view, like as is looking to invest in supporting Africa to develop their domestic space programs. Not in the same way that the European Union is doing or even Italy is doing. However, there is a strong interest in more of a partnership among equals, where we both have something we're trying to get out of it. So for example, I'll point to the new low Earth orbit constellations that are really revolutionizing access to data and is building out digital infrastructure in a new way. Where instead of having to lay cable and fiber, which can be very challenging in landlocked nations or there's 100 ways that it's difficult to put traditional ground-based telecommunications down. That using space is a good way to be able to sort of leapfrog forward for connectivity. But those satellites still need to have a place to downlink that information to be able to access, the internet, which is still very much on the Earth, And so those are, for example, points of presence or gateways or Earth stations where that information is downloaded. So this is mutually useful to these U.S. companies, that are providing a service that needs to interface with, actual land, where you would build infrastructure to accommodate that. There's a good business case for it that results in a very practical expansion of skill sets and equipment and presence in Africa. So that's more of the realm that I think the U.S. is working. Although I kind of gave a laundry list of more scientific oriented cooperation that is absolutely moving forward. So there's a couple of ways that cooperation will go on.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly add that it's quite true that the US government certainly is not taking a developmental approach the way the EU is. And this is why, again, I harken back to the academic partnerships approach to develop the capability. For example, we know that in many occasions in the past, we've had situations. I used to work in international development, and we have many stories of white elephants that have been sold with huge World Bank loans and other programs that people buy stuff they don't know how to fix. So I'm very concerned about ensuring that there is a sort of there's a literacy, there's a functional literacy, a futures literacy, sustainability literacy, that a science literacy, so that there has to be at least 1 or 2 universities in every country where there is a space agency. So it's Kenya, it's Nigeria, it's Ghana. Those are the ones I've been to so far. Hopefully next year I'll do Rwanda and Senegal. They've just signed the Artemis Accord. So I'm really looking at Senegal now as a place to find a university to say, hey, you need to take up space. Nobody's going to come and hand you any information. AID is dead. It will not be resurrected. Get over it. I worked in development for 30 years, so I know that space very well, having worked in the Inter-American Development Bank for 30 years. And so I feel that if we can have a place to begin to educate people how to, first of all, think about the future of science, think about the future of space, and think about how do you educate your negotiation team to say to company X, okay, fine, we're going to buy so many millions of dollars of your equipment, or yes, we're going to allow you to do business here, but here's what you have to do for us. You have got to do X, Y, Z. You've got to put a lab in this school. You've got to teach our classes how to do this, machine learning or whatever. We know that Kenya is a destination, for example, for the low-end AI training. How do we upscale it to the next level? And I think that is both the responsibility of the African governments to understand how to go to the negotiation table with a little bit more street smarts, if you will, than they have in the past. And so, again, it's, as I say, it's a new day. So they have got to understand it's a new reality. And I do think that they might have to call back some of the old people that were there from certainly the Bush Africa Bureau, which was very, actually during the Bush era and in the State Department, was a very strong, and a lot of things got done in the Bush era in State Department for Africa. So I do think this university is certainly well poised to play a role in moving things forward.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? The last question? Yes?
Hi, good morning. My question is to Dr. Claire Nancy.
My question is related to the legal frameworks and the legal work that you've mentioned in Africa, especially in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. I wanted to know how you think lawyers who are from Africa who have studied in the United States can be of support to these initiatives. I have my own LLC. I do legal research work, and I'm currently focusing on emerging issues such as this. And I have a national security law background, but I wanted to kind of focus on these areas, and I want to know how you think lawyers who have studied in the United States can be of assistance in these areas. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have found that, and I'm a little bit of a subversive, I have to confess, right? So if you wait on the status quo to move, it's not going to happen. And so the universities I'm working with, yes, some of them I do have an agreement with the official DOM. But I'm really working very hard to promote what certainly is happening in Nigeria. They have a very strong space club movement, right? And so while you wait for, let's say, the administrations to do certain things, I think working with the space clubs movements that are cropping up in universities, but some of them are very legally focused, some of them are very engineering focused, and I'm suggesting to them, you need to have a coming together because you can't be either or. The space club must have everybody in the ecosystem because it's an ecosystem. And so if you take the Artemis course, for example, and that's why I love analog space research. You need everybody at the table. You need the medical people, you need the lawyers, you need the business people, the finance people. Now you have an opportunity as a space club to begin to do the work that perhaps the African Union Space Agency can't do. You can actually, as young people, model these things, do the simulations, write the papers, and so expertise like yours could come in and say, okay, I'm going to run something online, I'm going to run a case study, I'm going to give them information to play with. We now have to take that knowledge and put it in a space. My proposal at the AIAA, a couple of years ago, I was selected for my idea of what I call a Space Futures Collaboratory. I'm still trying to find a home for this thing, which exists all in my mind. But we have got to create a playground, right? A playground where we can begin to have the simulations, whether they be modeled literally on a computer or whether they be like human simulations. We've got to begin to simulate the future that we fear and the future we want so that we make better decisions. So any help with the case studies, lectures, supporting these student clubs, while we wait on the law schools to get on board, because they always take longer to change systems. So I'm working a lot through space clubs to be able to move faster.
Can I add a for instance to give you kind of a concrete example to what you just said? So for instance, with Artemis, there are countries asking questions like, well, what's in it for us because America gets more of the bounty, so to speak. And so there is, Australia has some reservations because I'm not gonna ground this in too many details. But say, for instance, you're Australia and they're raising some concerns. They're saying, well, we have the Moon Treaty and there are some issues there. There are some very concrete problems that need legal assistance regarding space, right? So you're Australia and you're looking at the Artemis Accords as a space lawyer and you're trying to figure out, well, what's in our best interest? What do we have to give away to be a part of Artemis, which I love the idea of Artemis, and I'm an American, so of course I'm going to say, well, of course this makes sense that America is going to think about our needs first. But that's a legal point to argue, right? There are legal points that's being argued around, the outer space treaty and what we mean about weapons of mass destruction, where we have weapons. I promised I wasn't going to talk about hypersonics, but we have very strong conventional weapons, and I can talk about those weapons all day long, but there are different arguments that are being made where we need lawyers to be able to work these things out with treaties and agreements. There's a very real practical place. So your question was, how do American lawyers, trained lawyers, can help in terms of work that's being done on a continent? Simply by explaining, what's in said country's best interest. How do we come to the negotiating table and make a deal that works for us? So by simply understanding the landscape, by simply understanding those legal arguments, you are putting African countries in a better position if you understand that point of view from the United States. So that's a kind of practical answer to your question.
Thank you so
Very
much.
practical. While we wait on my dream, that actually we'll do space differently. I think a Space Futures Collaboratory, as I see it, is an opportunity for people to recognize that we cannot repeat the mistakes of our existence here on Earth. And so as I see a Space Futures Collaboratory, it will be a place where we have everybody, industry, academia, law, and depending on the question, we're now able to simulate, well, if we did X, Y, Z, here's what could happen. And the beauty about a practice like that, because we've gotten so good at doing gaming, right? You can literally immerse somebody in a reality that for 3 weeks they forget they're not doing it, then you really see if you really want to be doing this or not.
Thank you so much. Because of time, we can take one question virtually from Zoom. What is the question?
Okay, yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I really thank all the speakers. Very interesting panel. I just wanted to ask, this question. What do you see, as the main obstacles, preventing the development of space countries' infrastructures, such as launch pads in some African countries? Instead of focusing, which is very important, on education, and it needs to be done. But I was wondering, why not considering renewing facilities like, for example, the cooperation between Italy and Kenya, because they cooperate together with on the Malindi Space Center, the Luigi Broio space stations, and then also, while I agree that it's important investing in education, especially for our continent, with the world's youngest workforce, but these future professionals, we also need tools and facilities. So, given that, I know that you are not African leaders, but based on your experience in Africa and elsewhere, what models or examples have you seen that could help support the development of such infrastructures? Thank you.
I'm going to take a stab at it only because I know some people in Kenya playing around with it. They're trying to raise money, quite frankly, to do anything from building clean rooms. And Kenya, as you know, is pretty sophisticated when it comes to technology. But the question is, because of the export controls of the United States, until companies, certainly US companies, are very clear that they're not going to be contravening US law, then perhaps, so maybe it comes back to the question, what's in it for them? If it is that you're saying to a country, you can join our team, Mr. Corris, but no, our private sector can't invest in your country to build a capacity to launch, then really what's in it for them? I don't know, I'm not at that pay grade, but I do think that while we work that out, I don't want a US company to say, hey, or an Italian company, we're gonna build a launch pad in Kenya, and then no engineer in school even know how to put in the bolt of the concrete that's gonna be the launch pad. So I'm saying, while we do that, let's not make the mistake of the past. I know sooner or later there'll be a breakthrough and somebody will invest in a launch pad on the equator. It makes common sense. Therefore, I believe that in the meantime, let's do the engineering and the education and the legal preparation. So when the companies come, because they can come, the African countries and students and engineers and architects are prepared to actually benefit from that business opportunity.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, because of time, we have to move on to our next session. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Claire Nelson, Dr. Nola Haynes, Dr. Claire Rocher, and Colonel Nello Violetti. Thank you for such a powerful and opening conversation. We've heard that Africa must be present in global governance, that partnerships are vital, and that space security, economic growth, and inclusivity must be tackled together. Please continue the dialogue online using the hashtag Beyond Boundaries 2025, Why Africa, Why Now, Space Policy. So we're going to be moving on to our next session, a fireside chat with Rama Afulo on diaspora innovation and space entrepreneurship. Please listen. Thank you.